This is Jeff Mayers from WisPolitics.com and WisBusiness.com beginning our program today. Welcome, everybody.
Thank you.
So this is a special program we're doing, and it's organized by WisPolitics and WisBusiness. It's called Trade Reset, how a new Washington, D.C. administration may change trade policy near and far. And this program is done with support from the government of Canada. So thank you very much for that. So I want to introduce our panelists today. We're going to have an hour-long discussion with questions from the audience and questions from me. If you have any questions you want to submit, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and then I will review those in the second part of the program. So I want to introduce our panelists. First of all, we have Congressman Ron Kind. He's represented Wisconsin's 3rd Congressional District since 1997. Congressman Kind is a member of the Ways and Means Committee, which has jurisdiction over a wide range of policies. He's on the subcommittee on health, and he's also on the subcommittee on trade, which is one of the reasons he's here today. And in addition to his committee work, Ron is focused a lot on the issues of agriculture reform. Thank you very much for coming, Congressman. We also have Wayne Robson. He's the current acting Canadian Consul General in Chicago. Before coming to Chicago, he served as Consul General in Saigon and in various positions at missions in Japan, Australia, South Korea, and Mexico. He has been in Chicago for nearly 4 years and spent much of that time serving as the Senior Trade Commissioner, overseeing investment into Canada. Thank you very much, Consul General Robson. And we also have Sandi Siegel. She's president of M.E. Day and Company, and she's a co-host of our Talking Trade webcast, and you can find that at WisBusiness.com. Thank you very much for coming, Sandi. And then we have Neal Kemmet. He's the CEO of ACE Ethanol in Stanley, Wisconsin. So I think we're ready to go. Thanks very much again. And again, audience, if you have questions, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So let me just start off with you, Congressman. President-elect Biden named his U.S. Trade Representative nominee today, Katherine Tai, and she is the Democratic Chief Trade Counsel for the House Ways and Means Committee. So you must know Katherine Tai, correct?
I do, Jeff, and thanks for the invitation to participate today. And I'm delighted to be here with Neal, ACE Ethanol. It's right on the border of my congressional district in the 7th up in Stanley. And Sandi, I've enjoyed your Talking Trade website as well. Delighted to be with you. And special thank you to Wayne Robson, who's the acting general counsel for the Canadian Consulate out of Chicago. And we'll probably talk a little bit more about the new USMCA trade agreement, what that means for our respective trade relations. But Jeff, first of all, thoughts and prayers out to that F-16 pilot that went down over the Upper Peninsula. I mean, hopefully he can be recovered. And I've been in touch with General May as well as the commander of the 115 Fighter Wing, and we're still hoping and praying that we're going to be able to find him shortly. But I do know Katherine Tai. She's been staff director for trade for the Ways and Means Committee over the last 4 years. Incredibly competent, very professional, steeped in all trade policy. Before that, she was in the Obama USTR office. She's fluent in Mandarin, which I have a feeling is going to come in handy in the coming years, given our ongoing negotiations, given the trade irritants that we have with China right now. And I think she's just a solid choice there, and well respected on both sides of the aisle and in both houses, the House and the Senate. So I don't suspect much difficulty with her confirmation, and she will be a great ally when it comes to helping to hit the reset button on our trade policy as a country moving forward.
All right, so I want to stay with you, Congressman, right now. What about this reset? How are you and other members of the Ways and Means Committee and your subcommittee thinking about what might be taking place now with the new administration coming in?
Well, listen, I haven't been shy in offering my criticism of the current administration's trade policy. That tit-for-tat unilateral trade wars has not worked very well. It hasn't accomplished the objectives that President Trump set out. It's led to retaliation against our manufacturers, our family farmers, increased expenses for us consumers, because tariffs are hidden taxes that get passed on to us consumers. Why President Trump refuses to wrap his mind around that very basic economic concept is beyond me. So I suspect that in the early stages of the new Biden administration, there's going to be a lot of quick outreach with our traditional friends and allies to reset that relationship again. I think President Trump abused his 232 national security authority by imposing unilateral tariffs against our closest allies, including Canada and Mexico, not least of which Great Britain and the European Union and South Korea. These countries are not national security threats to the United States. And I think Congress has to look at 232. And I've offered bipartisan legislation with Mike Gallagher from Wisconsin to really give Congress a more meaningful voice and role before the imposition of these tariffs as we move forward with the new administration. So first, I think there's that relationship building that's going to have to take place. But the goals and the objectives that the Trump administration set out as it relates to China, I think will remain the same. The structural reforms that we're demanding China to do is something that we all share. It's the strategy and tactics I think will be different. There'll be a more multilateral, more collaborative approach, again, with our friends and allies standing by our side, demanding the type of structural changes that we've been asking of China for many years. I think that's going to give us enhanced leverage and credibility. It's going to make it harder for China to retaliate only against us. And through that collective voice of like-minded democratic nations who share our values, by the way, I think that's the type of pressure we need to bring to bear against China, whether it's through an outside collaborative process, whether it's through negotiations in the World Trade Organization, or figuring out a way, and I think this is important, and we should talk about this later, Jeff, a way for the United States to rejoin the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement, because the structural changes that we were demanding of China were contained in the TPP. But unfortunately, President Trump on day one decided to withdraw us from that agreement. And now we're on the outside looking in at the fastest growing economic region in the entire globe, the Pacific Rim area. And China is expanding their influence in this area right now too. So that should be another strategy that we should be willing to look at as we move forward with the new administration.
Yeah, TPP sounds like, seems like eons ago, Congressman. So let me go to Consul General Wayne Robson in Chicago. Wayne, you know, Canada's Wisconsin's #1 trading partner. You're part of the USMCA, and I'm wondering what you and Canada are looking for from the new administration, the reset.
So first of all, let me thank you for inviting me to join today. We really appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation. Thank you for Congressman Kind for being with us as well. I think it really adds to the type of conversation we can have today. So Canada, of course, works with only one administration at a time in the United States. And so we look forward to the change of administration that's going to occur on January 20th. But we are currently taking a look at what we can expect out of the new administration based on what their platform is, what their previous practices are, the kinds of people that they're putting in position in new places. And I think that gives us some hints, some ideas about where we can go when we start working with the new administration. And so as far as the trade reset is concerned, I had the opportunity to sit on an economic symposium by the Federal Reserve here in Chicago on Friday, and they talked about some of the things that Congressman Kind just mentioned, which was, on issues related to China, for example, that their expectation is that the tone will remain the same, but the style will probably change a little bit. And, in some of the areas where Canada is very active on multilateral institutions, for example, working with the WTO, et cetera. The history is that that's been an area where President-elect Biden has been very active, and that's some of the things that we're seeing and some of the positions that he's putting in place on the economic side. And so we look forward to that. You mentioned the new representative USDR nomination discussion that was going on this morning for Catherine Tai. Of course, she's been very active in the Ways and Means Committee and active on the USMCA file, or what Canada sometimes refers to as CUSMA, the Canada-U.S. Mexico agreement, and which I tend to call the new NAFTA, to be honest, just so that everybody understands what we're talking about, since every country now has a slightly different name for this agreement. But I think under her knowledge of the new NAFTA and of the rules that are in place, and the importance of putting rules in place on a bilateral, a regional, and multilateral basis, and then using those to have our discussions about how trade is done and give some certainty to business, I think is the way that all countries are looking for trade to operate, to provide some certainty to our businesses so they can understand their investments and business decisions that they take. And we look forward to more of that with the upcoming administration.
Okay, thank you very much, Wayne. Let's go to Sandi Siegel. Sandi is a co-host of Talking Trade, WISbusiness.com podcast. You can see it at WISbusiness.com. Sandi, what are you looking for? You're in the trenches there with Emmy Day and company in Milwaukee. What are you looking for out of the trade reset that we're going to go through here?
Well, I think in particular, so, for those of you that don't know, we are both a customs broker and freight forwarder. So we're assisting both importers and exporters in Wisconsin, primarily, and of course across the nation, with their purchases and their shipments. And so obviously very much affected by the trade laws as they evolve. And in regards to USMCA, while we're on that topic, the uncertainty, for both importers and exporters has been, so challenging to run their businesses. I had an importer who indeed brings in some of the aluminum and steel, affected by the 232, tariffs. And from the time they placed the order to getting the shipment, I think the tariffs changed 5 times because there was so much of a ping pong match going on for a while on, imposing them, lifting them, and back and forth in that regard. So it obviously makes it really difficult for customers to do pricing and, projections and so forth. So, and likewise on the China tariffs, it was such a dramatic impact on importers of both, finished goods as well as materials and, goods for components for, manufacturing and so forth. So it added such uncertainty to supply chains and pricing, and too quickly for people to be able to move supply chains or change their pricing with their customers. And, I think a little stability and more deliberate trade agreements, looking at the long term versus the short term, will certainly help, stabilize, trade agreements.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say there's been a fair amount of confusion out there about what's up, what's down. So let's go. I want to go welcome in Neal, who's the CEO of ACE Ethanol in Stanley. Welcome.
Thank you.
You're in the middle of farm country, and you deal a lot with Canada, with the ethanol trade to Canada. What is your view of how things may be reset here in the coming weeks?
Well, ACE Ethanol, just for some history here. So ACE Ethanol, historically has exported probably 70 to 80% of its ethanol to Canada. We also have an ethanol facility in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, and they export roughly 35 to 50% of their goods to Canada. So we've always been a major exporter to Canada. In fact, one quarter we had when Ben Bransel was with the Wisconsin government, we were the #1 producer, I think, for #1 exporter to Canada for 2 straight quarters. So we're big fans of Canada, and we've always had a terrific trade relationship with them. So we were a little nervous during the negotiation of the USMCA because when things weren't going very well, there was talk of a tariff potentially that was going to be put on ethanol, but that didn't materialize. The agreement got hammered out. So we see the transition between the 2 trade agreements from an ethanol standpoint as seamless. So we do export quite a few goods there now, and we look for that to continue. And then, also we're talking with Canadian customers now about potentially expanding. We sell a lot of co-products, a lot of our distillers grains up in Canada. That changed about a decade ago, but we think there's some opportunities to continue to expand our business. So trade is very important to ACE Ethanol. So, I couldn't agree with what Congressman Kine said more. And while ACE may be just outside his district, I actually live in his district, and I won't tell you who I vote for, but I always vote for a winner, Ron. So anyway, so and you know, China's obviously extremely important for us too, and you know, the structural changes that we needed in China. The Trump administration isn't out yet, and so I won't pass judgment on how he went about things, but the structural change was necessary there. Their decision on whether or not to import something, to give certificates for import, to put tariffs on things seemed very arbitrary at best. They've slapped a lot of tariffs on distillers grain. They used to be the #1 customer of distillers grain. They had too much corn inventory. They didn't want distillers grain anymore, so they shut that off. We were looking forward to starting to export them ethanol about 2 years ago. They had an E10 mandate because ethanol is a very green, low carbon fuel that cleans the environment substantially as composed to fossil fuels. They were going to start importing ethanol to meet their 10% mandate. But, through the trade wars and everything else, they scrapped that. And I think that, China's commitment to buy a bunch of corn and soybeans, while welcome, when we export raw materials like that, we export jobs. What my focus is on somebody who operates a manufacturing business is we want to export finished goods. We want to export distillers grains. We want to export ethanol. Those are the things we want to, we still want the demand to be there for the corn and the soybeans so the price remains high, but we'd rather, it makes great headlines to announce all these bean and corn shipments. It'd be better if we actually processed that, kept the jobs here in the United States, and had China buying our finished goods.
Yeah, let me just stick with you, Neal, on the USMCA. And so I think you indicated it's working well for you. Did things change much from the old NAFTA to the new NAFTA?
From my vantage point, it was seamless. So, I know there's other products, and I know dairy was a big point of negotiation. And, we have a lot of dairy customers who buy our products. But from an ethanol standpoint and from a distiller's grain standpoint, so from my business, it was pretty much a seamless transition.
And the feeling in ag country in Wisconsin over USMCA is generally positive?
Yeah, from everything I heard about it while it was being negotiated and once it was finalized, things were tenuous for a while, but I think all my takes have been positive on it.
Okay, I'm going to work backwards here and go to Sandi now. What have you been hearing? Again, let's just focus on USMCA in terms of how the transition has been from old NAFTA to new NAFTA.
From our customer base and in general, for all the hoopla and the attention it got in the negotiations, there really weren't dramatic changes that seem to impact any, certainly not in a negative way. Some positives for dairy farmers, a little bit more access to the Canadian market, some quotas lifted, and an increase in how much goods can be exported. So that was certainly a win. Otherwise, again, from a practical standpoint on the flow of goods and the documentation, actually a little bit easier in the document preparation and so forth, and some product verification. So, again, pretty seamless. And, obviously people have some questions. There's some subtle changes, an impact to the auto industry, which, I'm not directly involved with. And, but mostly seen as a positive. Haven't seen any negatives, that are impacting anybody at all.
Okay, I want to go to Consul General Wayne Robson now. So again, you folks are very involved in USMCA and implementing it, of course. How has it gone, the implementation? How has it gone for Canada, from Canada's point of view?
Well, first of all, let me echo what Sandi said, which was that a lot of the positive benefits of the USMCA or the new NAFTA is the fact that it put in place the rules that allowed that continuation of understanding of what the the regime was going to be, that the North American production platform could continue to work in. And there's a lot of investment from Canada into the US and US investment in Canada. These companies need to know what the rules are, what the standards are, and that they can go forward. And then after that, I would note that there was significant modernization in the NAFTA. I worked on the NAFTA 20 years ago in its original implementation and stages, and throughout a period of time after that. And again, of course, when I was spending time in Mexico, and revisiting it now that I'm here in Chicago in the United States, there was a need to modernize what was a 20-year-old agreement. There were sections of the NAFTA that just didn't exist on things like digital trade, et cetera, that had to be looked at. There was an opportunity to strengthen, the side agreements on both labor and environment, which was done, and we really, from the Canadian side, looked at those as wins out of the negotiations as well. And obviously there was, an enhanced and streamlined dispute settlement process that was put in place as well, along with the things that were already mentioned on, rules of origin, et cetera. So we took the modernization of the NAFTA as well as the putting in place as, really a good thing. July 1st, when it went into place, implementation legislation that was necessary in Canada was there. We're seeing, the ongoing implementation, because of course the day that it comes into effect isn't the day that you know exactly how everything is working. It's great to hear from Sandi that some of the changes that were made in the red tape and bureaucracy on the paperwork of coming in and going across the borders is working well. There's mechanisms in the NAFTA to continue to look at that. And if there's anything in there that makes sense to continue to put in place to do so. But we are in a bit of an implementation phase for some of those items that are in the USMCA, and so we think they're going smoothly from a Canadian side, but there are timelines for them, and some of them are continuing to move forward.
So today, I don't know whether you can talk about this, Wayne, but the the Trump administration is filing a dairy trade complaint, which is the first enforcement action under USMCA. Can you comment at all on that?
Sure, although you're going to be shocked to hear that Canada believes that it's fully compliant with the USMCA on its obligations related to dairy access. We're going to continue to engage with the US officials on exploring the tariff rate quota administration, which is the specific area that there's questions on. But there was a request for consultations. The new dispute settlement process I mentioned earlier streamlines that process, and quite frankly, that's in a mature trading relationship like the one we have with the United States and Canada, this is the way to go forward where you have disagreements on implementation or issues, irritants that are going forward. And so, there's a 15-day period for us to start those consultations. And frankly, the consultations have to be done within 30 days, or else you continue on and take a look at what the next steps are. We believe that we've provided additional market access to the United States, but we also take our obligations under the new TAFTA very seriously, and we look forward to the ongoing discussions on clarifying our TRQ provisions.
So in some ways, I guess what I'm gathering from you is this is how it's supposed to work.
Exactly.
Right.
A mature relationship, if there are any questions about whether it's implementation or irritants or things that are under the agreement, or frankly, how the agreement applies to things that weren't originally considered under the agreement, you go through a process of dialogue. It should be done in an efficient manner so that, there's quick answers to the kinds of questions that are being raised. But yeah, this is how the trading relationship is supposed to function.
Okay, Congressman Kind, you represent a huge swath of the dairy industry in your district, and and corn growers and ethanol makers. So at any rate, how do you think the USMCA is working so far, and do you see tweaks on the horizon that will need to be made?
Well, first of all, I agree with Wayne's kind of summary of what the new trade agreement is and what it's about. But let me quickly address the new action USTR took this week on the dairy TRQs as it relates to Canada. I was on the phone for quite a while with Bob Lighthizer yesterday, our current trade representative, in regards to that trade complaint that they were filing. And listen, Wayne will attest to this too. Getting any trade agreement passed through Congress these days is a heavy lift. And one of the things that members needed assurance on was fair but strong enforceability provisions, that all the parties were going to live up to the terms of the agreement. And if they didn't, there would be an opportunity, a mechanism in order to address any trade irritants. Now, we knew that, and we're sensitive to the fact that Canada has a different dairy market than we have in the United States. It's a supply management type of system. And so they're trying to protect that against the excess of imports coming in. But we also needed, in order to sell this trade agreement with our dairy farmers, with the American people, that it was a little more fair and balanced. And so I was one of those leading the effort to try to find a landing zone as it related to dairy with Canada. Even beyond that, SPS, sanitary, phytosanitary standards was an important part of the agreement. Poultry was another one as it related to Canada. And we just want to make sure that it's adhered to now. So as Wayne pointed out, we're going to go into consultation process, which is how the enforcement mechanism is set up. And hopefully, as Wayne described it, a mature relationship between our two countries will be able to resolve this before more extraordinary remedies having to be taken on the dairy front. But that was viewed as significant progress in this new trade agreement. And USTR, I think to their credit, is paying close attention now on the implementation of it. And naturally, Canada is going to have a different point of view as far as whether they're adhering to the terms or not. And that's what the consultation process is meant to get at, to see if we can resolve it. But again, I think 70% of the new agreement with Canada and Mexico was the old NAFTA. I mean, there wasn't major changes as far as the tariff levels between the three countries. It was mainly an auto modernization bill at the end of the day, along with some of the progress we made on the agriculture front. Wayne pointed out significant progress with a new digital chapter. That too is part of the modern economy. And I think that lays a nice template for future trade agreements, what we did with Canada and Mexico under this new one. Strong labor, environmental chapters in it as well. But what I really liked about it too, and I don't know if Wayne wants to comment, but a lot of what we have in the new trade agreement with Canada and Mexico is very much reflective of what's already in the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement. So that if there comes an opportunity for the U.S. to find a way to get back in, it's not going to require much adjustment based on the new USMCA trade agreement that we're already a party of. But at a 30,000 foot level, Jeff, it's important that we have a good working trade relationship with our two border neighbors, our two largest export markets. Wayne emphasized the cross-border investment that we have with Canada. That too is important. So it was time to modernize the old NAFTA. It was over 25 years old. We had to bring it into the 21st century. I think what was done there in a lot of respects did that, but let's not also oversell the new agreement. It was very much the same NAFTA when it came into access to the markets with some, I think, significant areas of improvement in it too.
All right, well, let's go to the, China seems to loom large over everything, and trade doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? And so, Congressman, you brought up TPP a couple times here. Yeah, there was a lot of bipartisan cooperation on TPP before the current administration came in. And since then, just this year, China forged its own partnership agreement. And so that kind of leaves the U.S. sitting on the sidelines, so to speak. So you're calling for, Congressman, as I heard you right, calling for the U.S. to rejoin the TPP, right?
I am, with some adjustments. I think obviously a new Biden administration is going to want to put their fingerprints on this too and make some adjustments that they feel are necessary. But let's remember, Joe Biden was President Obama's vice president at the time TPP was being negotiated to begin with. So he was heavily involved in the intricacies of those talks and the importance and the strategic value of it too. And I've commented numerous times that I think our withdrawal from TPP is one of the great strategic mistakes we're making as a country in the 21st century. Because in a lot of respects, this was about China's growth. It was about containing China's excesses and setting new standards, higher standards of global trade relations that surrounded China. And I believe, as many experts do, that at some point China is going to want to be in. And if they do get in, they're going to have to adhere to these much higher standards and greater protections and requirements that exist under TPP. So I think that should still be a goal. I don't think it's going to be out of the block type of issue for a new Biden administration, but it's one that we have to be considering and thinking long-term on. Jeff, as you pointed out, China just moved forward on a new comprehensive trade agreement within the region. Other countries now are looking to join that China is leading. That is not a good position for us or even Canada or Mexico to be following China around in that Pacific Rim area. And so we've got to find a way for us to become relevant, to get inside that tent again, and to be offering our values and principles when it comes to trade relations, again, in the fastest growing economic region throughout the globe, which is the Pacific Rim area. And our relationship with China is the most important global relationship of the 21st century. It does not necessarily have to go down the path of a brutal Cold War as we had with the Soviet Union for most of the 20th century, but it's a competitor. And in some respects, they're adversaries in what they're trying to accomplish. Trade is more than goods and products and services crossing border. It's an important part of our diplomatic and our national security arsenal. And we need to be wise in how we use that, especially as it relates to China.
Okay, I want to come back to Wayne at the end here. I wanted to go first to Sandi and then Neal on, the whole aspect of, China trade and what were some hurdles and what could be some ways to make it better. So Sandi, what are your customers telling you?
Well, I guess I'd like to first comment on Congressman Kine's remarks in terms of the lost opportunity of the TPP, and I think Obama's strategy, President Obama's strategy, was that was a way of influencing the region and in China, and it was an opportunity to to help in our negotiations. So again, a lost opportunity there, and now this new RCEP trade agreement that we're not a part of. So we're losing ground, and I think that is important because they are obviously such a huge player in the economy, and I echo also a competitor digitally and economically, and in military and everything else. So but it's from the import perspective and export, they're number 3 in our export market, and from our customer base, it's our number 1 imports, and it's they have grown to be such an important part of our supply chains. And when the 301 tariffs came in from the Trump administration, with a strategy of pushing people to buy domestically, it just wasn't realistic, certainly not in the short term. And I think some of the agreements the strategies of the Trump administration were short-sighted. I did a lot of conversations with our customers and in the field, and customers like Kohler and heavy manufacturers. You can't move your supply chain overnight. They take years of working with factories and having the machines specially built, and there's places, things in China that only China has the machines, and certain, wearing apparel and so forth. So, these are long-term strategies. If, in fact, you're trying to encourage people to move their supply chains. And as it turned out, if customers, importers looked elsewhere, they looked, elsewhere in Asia. They looked to Vietnam, they looked to Taiwan and Indonesia, and we saw very little coming back to the US because we simply don't have that type of manufacturing here. So I think the Biden administration has a focus of, supporting the US manufacturers, but looking at that in conjunction with what are we good at and what investments do we need to make here for the long term, in balancing that. But the additional tariffs from China had such a huge impact financially on importers, again, both raw materials and finished goods, obviously passed on to consumers, and in some cases, put several people out of business, which, was really, obviously pretty devastating. So, again, I think there's a lot to be said for the multilateral approach, where we do share values of our allies, and where we can, again, look at some long-term strategies on how we all benefit and use our shared values in making these negotiations.
Okay, thanks, Sandi. Neal, what from your viewpoint about the China factor, China trade, it seems to loom large over everything. What do you think could improve in that arena?
Well, it absolutely does loom large. And, I'll just talk about, talking about the ethanol industry in general, you have your domestic customers and you have your foreign customers. And, you know, we're always fighting big oil to grow market share domestically, but, you know, we continue to do that. They're the most powerful industry ever in the history of mankind. And, you know, we fight them on a daily basis for local market share. But then we have these other customers, which are our exports, which, you know, they're imports. So in the last 2 years, you know, actually within the last 6 months, we lost basically our largest export customer, which was Brazil, because of punitive tariffs. And that's happened in the last 6 months. That was our number one export customer, was Brazil. So we lost those due to tariffs. And then, you know, within the last couple of years, we've lost our number one potential target for imports, which was China. And, you know, that's when I, you know, started out by alluding to the structural changes. So when all these trade wars happened, you know, about 4.5 years ago, China was our number one DDG importer. Most of our DDG exports went to China. It wasn't even close. And then they slapped a tariff on us. And then those basically dried up. So tariff, somewhere around 70, 75, 80% tariff on our products. Then fast forward a couple years later, trade war with China, about 2 years ago, they have about a 70 to 75% tariff on ethanol. So we had basically our number one developing market, which is Asia, and China is the most populous of them, the one with them and India have the dirtiest air. They stand to benefit the most from ethanol's low carbon, clean footprint. And due to the trade war, 70% tariffs, non-competitive. DDGs to China, non-competitive, 70% tariff. So it's really structural changes in, you know, the slogan was right, that, you know, it's got to be fair trade, not just, you know, free trade. So the slogan's right, but how do you get to, you know, executing on the strategy and getting the trade agreements in place that grant you access to markets? You know, we've got a great product, but we're not allowed to compete. So, you know, that's not the fault of the industry. That's something that needs to be worked out between the U.S. government and the China government. But you know, they're very good at you know, making situations non-competitive. So, you know, we do need to have that fair trade, and we just, from my industry standpoint, you know, we don't have a chance for fair and free trade in China the way things are going right now.
Okay.
So hopefully a change with the Biden administration. Hopefully we'll get to refocus on this with a reset. But you know, as it sits right now, it's not a good situation for us.
Okay, well, Wayne, you heard from all the.
There's a lot there to unpack. Yeah.
Yeah. So what's your take on Canada, U.S., TPP, China?
Yeah, so let's start a little bit with the Canada-U.S. discussion, and then see where some of those other things fall into place. I mean, Canada does more trade with the United States and this area around the Midwest and Wisconsin than we do with China, Japan, and the UK combined. So, you know, most important trading partner that we have in a lot of fronts, and we're always keeping an eye on the things that are affecting both our bilateral trade, but also things that affect you know, trade generally and our top trading partners. And so what does that mean when we start to talk about things like TPP, where when Canada joined the negotiations to accede to the TPP and ultimately was one of the first 5 countries that ratified it, we were in discussions with Mexico and the United States at the same time. To circle back to some of the earlier discussions, some of the same trade professionals and negotiators that work in Canada, the United States, and Mexico on the USMCA or the new NAFTA worked on the TPP and continue to work on other issues as well. And so what we have is we have a lot of strong institutional knowledge there. You know, should there be movement on the TPP, and Canada welcomes if the U.S. joins, much like the Congressman said, if anybody else looks to join the TPP, we want to maintain the high standards that we have in the TPP. We call it the CPTPP, which does not roll off the tongue, the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, because when we joined it, we asked for some additional changes on labor and environment. And much as was mentioned by Congressman Kind, it does provide an opportunity when you do these kinds of negotiations with other countries on a regional or a multilateral basis to have a discussion about other things that help with global security or global understanding of norms and regulations. And you know, it's a good entree there with both environment and labor, but it does, you know, deepen the dialogue, provide you with more interlinkages between the countries and other areas where you can have discussions. We certainly would welcome the United States coming back into the TPP discussion or the CPTPP discussion. I think we have a different name for everything nowadays. But we also look forward to the possibility of having discussions, on some other multilateral issues in other forums like the WTO. I think what we saw when we saw the 232 discussions that happened earlier this year, and when Canada was affected on issues of aluminum and steel, that there was an underlying issue there of Chinese overproduction and what to do about it. There probably were some ways that were better to deal with it than taking someone like Canada, who clearly is not a security threat, and applying 232 regulations, which are meant to provide security certainty to the relationship. Canada is part of the production platform for North America. We have memorandums of understanding about how we're part of the defense production platforms in the United States. And I was pleased to see earlier this week when they were discussing about the NDAA, there was a recognition on an international basis about the importance of working with key allies and partners on maintaining security for some trade, because frankly, trade does produce, the possibilities of lower prices for your consumers, getting inputs from other sources that are going to make you more competitive in a local basis. I mean, again, around the Midwest area, Canada's exports to the United States are 65% primary and secondary products, which the US then turns into other products and exports or sells locally. And so we make things together. And we need to be looking at the ways that we can make things together effectively and competitively and sell them to each other in a way that makes us both stronger and get economic benefit. And whether that's in, the things that we're dealing with on COVID, personal protective equipment, whether or not it's the ongoing work that we're doing on therapeutics and vaccines and other things that are addressing our current problems. And I'm sure the conversation will at some point get to the role that trade plays in addressing COVID, but also addressing, our recovery. And our government used the term "build back better" in their fall economic statement. And we're all looking at the possibility of how can we recover from, stabilize, recover from the things that COVID has put us through over the last year, and then move forward in a way that also takes advantage of things like equity and racial disparities, and think about how we can bring that into the ongoing economic recovery. So it's a wide area of topics that you discuss there. I'm not going to specifically get into US-China discussions, but I would say that there is a lot of room to be using those international mechanisms and our bilateral mechanisms to move forward in those areas.
Okay, well, that brings us, Wayne, thanks. That brings us to an audience question about COVID and the effect of, the trade wars on dealing with COVID and dealing with the pandemic. And I don't know, have we, I think we can throw this out to the panel. Have we learned lessons from these episodes in terms of dealing with future pandemics, dealing with the current one and dealing with future pandemics? Congressman, what did this past year tell you about how trade and COVID interacted?
Well, Jeff, before I address that, Neal, I'm going to reach out to you too to talk to you more about the ongoing discussions we're having with Brazil, especially as it relates to ethanol. We've been working with USTR and the Department of Commerce, so I'd like to get your perspective too, and also fill in a few blanks on that. So we'll try to set that up soon. And I'm glad Wayne also recognized the important role that the World Trade Organization does bring. I drafted a resolution that passed unanimously out of the Ways and Means Committee recently, recognizing the importance of the WTO as an institution, multilateral, that helps us resolve trade disputes peacefully, so we don't have to resort to self-help. We don't have to resort to trade wars. We don't have to resort to the 1930s type of shutdown of trade. And we saw what dark alley that brought the world to as a consequence. But it's also in desperate need of reform that we recognize too. And hopefully with Canada's help and other like-minded nations, we're going to be able to accomplish that with the dispute resolution panel that's effectively shut down right now, and it's paralyzing the institution. COVID has really exposed the importance of supply chains. Sandi was mentioning this a little bit earlier. The Ways and Means Committee have had a few hearings already to understand the dynamics of why we were caught so flat-footed with the supply chain needs when it comes to dealing with the battle against COVID-19 and some of the shortages that we were running into. But it extends much broader than just this current pandemic, Jeff. we have to have a greater understanding of the implications and the integration of these supply chains. And as Sandi pointed out, you can't unravel that overnight. And it's going to create severe disruptions and huge distortions in the market, including price and shortages, unless we have a better understanding and the ability to look around the corner a lot easier than we have right now. So we're not caught so flat-footed in some future crisis. So that's one of our priorities on the trade subcommittee right now, is a greater understanding. And Sandi, with your help, hopefully we can get some more feedback from companies back home here, how they have been individually impacted by COVID and the supply disruptions that have occurred, so that policy-wise we can work on things that make sense, and it's going to make it a lot more seamless.
Sandi, do you have anything to add on supply chains, fighting COVID?
Well, absolutely. Yes. I've said it before. It's, the worst part of this is that COVID came on the heels of, a couple of years of trade wars. So, as Neal explained in his scenario, and all these punitive, duties that were in reaction to our 232 duties, and then with China and the 301 duties. So, exporters were already, affected, and importers were affected by the additional duties, and then COVID came along. So now you have, again, that uncertainty on top of tariff uncertainties and market uncertainty. And I've been in this industry several decades, and I have never seen such disruption in supply chains. Freight rates are at an all-time high. And, there's so much congestion and challenges in space availability because the normal cycles of supply chains were so disrupted by COVID. The ports and the rails and the terminals and the truckers and everyone is shorter staffed to work all of, the freight coming in and going out. So we're seeing, an additional 10 days to 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and sometime, in some cases of freight moving because you can't get space on on vessels. The carriers, from a political standpoint, the carriers have a lot to do with it and are somewhat, they took a lot of vessels out of rotation to try to, maintain pricing and deal with their supply and demand issues. And now it's, we literally cannot get space sometimes for 2 and 3 weeks, both on import and export, to move cargo, in and out of the U.S. And then when it does come in, it's sitting out at port. I think Long Beach has, reported its worst ever congestion, and, containers stacking up, and that's around the world. So it's, it's really a worldwide issue in trying to rebalance trade and trying to project, which I think we're all still struggling to know what's going to happen in, the first and second quarter economically.
Okay, there's a couple I want to run through some audience questions. Here's one specifically on tariffs on steel. I'm going to read this one because it's from John Norquist. I think this might be the former mayor. Will Trump's obsession with levying tariffs on imported steel continue under Biden? Wisconsin manufacturers buy steel to make finished high-value goods. Virtually no steel and no aluminum is made in Wisconsin. Shouldn't Wisconsin Congress members and senators oppose steel and aluminum tariffs?
Jeff, that might be direct. Let me take a first shot at that. I have, but we also need to recognize some of the anti-dumping problems that Wayne alluded to earlier with China's overproduction, making sure they're not funneling it through third parties, other nations, to gain greater market share. But I, from the very beginning, opposed the steel and aluminum tariffs as it related to Canada and Mexico. I thought there was a much better way of addressing any concerns. But the Biden administration isn't going to be shy on the imposition of 301s and any anti-dumping and countervailing authority that they have. We need to be able to stand up and protect our interests as well. I don't see the Biden administration pulling back on that, but I think they're certainly going to be more judicious in exercising that authority. And I think there's going to be a much better cooperative relationship with our traditional friends and allies on this front, instead of resorting as quickly as the Trump administration did to these unilateral tariffs, knowing the retaliation that it invites.
Yeah. Wayne, would you like to weigh in on that?
Sure. Listen, on the issue of steel in particular, I mean, it's when you look at Canada-U.S. trade in steel and Canada-U.S., frankly, ownership and investment in the steel manufacturing facilities on both sides of the border, our trading relationship is largely the equal, reciprocal. It's not always the best way to look at things, but in this particular case, we're the number one destination for exports of U.S. steel, and we receive more steel from the U.S. than we export to the United States. A lot of our steel production manufacturing in Canada is U.S. owned, and it's a rationalization across the border of how we're working again as a North American production platform. We did eventually get to, I think, a more sophisticated discussion on the issues of steel and third parties in Canada, and there were some additional measures taken in Canada to provide some confirmation to the United States about where Canadian production was coming from. And tracking steel that comes in and out of Canada from other locations other than the United States. There's always been, frankly, a very strong tracking mechanism on a bilateral and a trilateral basis with Mexico on NAFTA steel, and where that NAFTA steel has gone, because there's been, frankly, a lot of disputes under the U.S.-Canada Free Trade Agreement, and then under NAFTA on steel. And so I think there's a much more sophisticated discussion that occurs in the steel industry related to what happens in North America versus what happens elsewhere. And I think there are other issues to deal with in other areas. And we look forward to working with the United States and other like-minded partners on addressing those structural issues, and including with, countervailing duties and anti-dumping type mechanisms to make sure that surges are addressed appropriately when they're unfair.
Okay, now there's a question here specifically about lumber prices, and there was some reporting this week on lumber prices skyrocketing. The questioner asked whether that's at all due to tariffs. Are the lumber price, or is that just demand from the housing market?
I can make a first comment. Yeah. First of all, I'll say that one of the bright spots in the U.S. economy, according to that Federal Reserve forecast that I was at on Friday, is that housing starts are very good. In fact, housing starts over the course of this year look like they'll be the same as they were in 2016, which is a real positive for the U.S. economy. But that does mean that their need for lumber is high. And the U.S. lumber production capacity is only 70% of their domestic needs. And so Canada is a safe, close local supply of lumber into the U.S. market, and it does help deal with the price of lumber in the U.S. to be able to get reliable, easy access. We talked a little bit about freight before, and Sandi was talking about vessels. No need to put stuff from Canada on a ship. You can put it in a truck. You can put it on a train that's coming down if you want to, and it needs to get down fast enough. You can put it on an air cargo, which is booming right now, although I wouldn't do that with wood, to be perfectly honest. But it is another area where it has been an irritant on bilateral relationships. We're continuing to use the mechanisms that we have, both under the USMCA and at the WTO, to talk to the United States about it, and we hope that there'll be some more relief on what we believe are unfair duties on Canadian lumber coming in. But we are also a continuing supplier and an important source, I think, into that U.S. market.
Yeah, and Jeff, if I may add too, this was also another issue that U.S. and Canada, I think, found a landing zone for with USMCA. It was turning into a trade irritant, especially on the soft lumber supply. And we focused on that along with the agricultural issues with Canada. And now we've got mechanisms, I feel, that we can have a much more earnest conversation about this when things do arise. But I'd also be remiss if I didn't thank John Norquist for tuning in. It's always good to hear from John. And he's been a longtime friend of mine and one of the great thinkers on urban renewal and revitalization efforts. So I hope he's doing well today.
I'm sure he is. Okay, so we're running out of time here, and I want to, I don't know how many times tariffs and duties have come up in this conversation. And I don't think anybody expects tariffs to go away, but certainly they were the go-to tactic for the Trump administration. And I guess I'm wondering what you see in your crystal ball, or what you would urge policymakers to do in regards to tariffs. Should Congress take back some of that tariff power? Does the president have too much tariff power? Are there just too many tariffs? Neal, you were very pointed in this in terms of certain markets are just unfair because of the tariffs. And I'm wondering, how to sort of get over that? Because it seems to be interfering with a lot of free flow of goods.
Yeah, I mean, I wish I had some answers for you, but you know, the only solution long term is through like the TTP, through the USMCA. So you got to be out in front of this and negotiating these treaties, these trade treaties, so that we don't get into a situation where you can be arbitrarily penalized by another country's government. Yeah, so if you don't do the hard work up front through these negotiated deals, then you're always going to be subject to unfair penalties.
Right. So you know, multi-nation deals, not just bilateral deals.
Sure, right. Like TTP for sure. You know, we've mentioned that before. You know, I saw that as something that could potentially be very positive, and then it got scrapped. And you know, it got scrapped in favor of bilateral negotiations, which you could see a path where that could also be very successful. But you know, it's also a lot of work to do bilateral agreements with every one of your trade partners as well.
So Sandi, I mean, you know, I mean, you've earned your pay here over the past 4 years because of all these tariffs, explaining them and whatnot. But you know, I'm sure you'd like a more stable playing field, right?
Well, not only, you know, stable, but you know, my career has been in trade, and I'm a huge advocate of free trade. And I think, you know, we have to remember and think on the bigger scale that it's a global economy, number one. So, and free trade is what helps all of us be more competitive in, you know, our resources and making finished goods and so forth, and doing what we're good at, and you know, looking to our foreign partners for where we, you know, can realize some benefits. And one of the things that's been suggested that this new administration might do differently is specific tariffs, if there are any, in the way of anti-dumping orders or you know, specific things on particular commodities, or even, you know, down to specific suppliers, as anti-dumping can do, as opposed to a broad brush, you know, like the 301 tariffs on China. There was so much time and energy imposing all these tariffs, and then companies having to argue to get them pulled back, where they could justify, you know, they couldn't source goods elsewhere by, you know, the way of getting exemptions. So I think that's a more realistic approach, because certainly there are areas where we need to level the playing field to, you know, protect our U.S. industries. But you know, historically, these free trade agreements with various countries has been a way to solidify our relationships and help their economies and ours as well. And, you know, I certainly hope it's something we can look forward to.
All right, Congressman Kind, I mean, should Congress try to take some of this tariff power back from the president?
Jeff, you're asking a member of Congress whether Congress should have more power. The short answer is yes, of course. And I've introduced bipartisan legislation. I mentioned the one bill that Mike Gallagher and I have introduced. I've done it with Jackie Walorski and Mike Kelly and Darren LaHood, Republican members of the Ways and Means Committee. And I think obviously it's reflective of the last 4 years and what we feel has been an overreach on the use of 232s. And even as Sandi pointed out, the indiscriminate wide use of 301 authority. But at the end of the day, you know, trade's a tough issue. It's a tough issue politically because you need to get the buy-in of the American people, the people you're representing, so that they understand the benefits of it and the job creating opportunity that it brings back home here. And it's easy to turn that around and to scare people and to blame foreigners for their economic condition in life and to blame it on trade in specifically and pretend like you're standing up for American production and manufacturing when in fact you're wreaking damage to it. I mean, the trade wars that we've had has been devastating to our farmers, our family farmers in Wisconsin. We've had record family farm bankruptcies 3 years running right now. It's not all because of trade policy, but it's piling on at the wrong moment for them and making it difficult for them to get a decent marketplace because of the excess surplus that's being produced right now. So Congress needs to, I think, be more involved. We have that authority under the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8. Congress throughout the ages have decided to delegate that authority to the executive branch to negotiate on our behalf. And if we see an overreach and abuse of that, I think it's important for Congress to roll back some of that authority so that we can work with any administration and get the buy-in of the people back home who we're representing of why this makes sense, why it's going to be supportive of job creation back home too. But without it, it's much more difficult politically to pass anything then when it comes up. And one other point I would raise, these mini trade deals that the Trump administration has been fond in doing, the reason they're doing it is to bypass Congress and to not consult with us. And that's a road to nowhere, because the mini deals can't accomplish a lot by definition. They have to be very de minimis, or it requires congressional approval. So you don't get a lot out of all the energy being expended there to begin with. And you're losing opportunities, I think, as Neal pointed out, on a much more comprehensive multilateral approach of accomplishing more. But you need to be willing to work with Congress and therefore the American people much greater in order to pull that off. And this current administration has been loath to do that. And I'm hoping that the new administration will do a much better job reaching out to Congress as a partner in all this, as we should be, but also explaining to the American people about what's at stake. And it's not just us. I mean, it's Sandi, you got a role to play. Neal, you've got a role to play too, of explaining to folks back home why this is important for our economy.
All right, thanks, Congressman. And Neal, Wayne, Consul General Robson, you're going to have the last word here. I'm not trying to drag you into internal U.S. Who should have the power disputes, but in terms of, you mentioned the WTO, and I think I've heard you say just a more normalized way of dealing with disputes. So tariffs isn't the instrument, the tactic that has to be used.
Yeah. So as you discussed, tariffs are or can be a blunt instrument. And when tariffs are used as a blunt instrument, there's usually unintended consequences and frankly, people and countries that are hit that aren't intended. And then you end up working back for them. On the other hand, every country will say that they need to have the appropriate tools to protect free and fair trade. They're going, and Canada would say the same thing. And that's why when you look at some of the mechanisms at the WTO or in the NAFTA or the TPP to deal with things like anti-dumping measures or countervailing duty measures, which are meant to deal with inappropriate dumping of low price goods into a market or to deal with subsidies in a home market, those are entirely appropriate. Those are tools that are available to a country to deal with trade that is not happening in a fair manner and not consistent with the expectation that the countries are going to be following those rules. So as far as the tariff authority in the United States, I'm not going to speak on where that should be vested. I will say that it's entirely appropriate for any country, including the United States, to be looking at the tools that they can use in order to manage their trade. And this is where I'll give a plug to the bilateral trade. The more sophisticated and the more integrated your production processes are between two countries like they are between Canada and the United States, the more you're going to be able to overcome difficulties as they come forward. And I'll go back to COVID to make my final point on that, which is we've had some problems since March related to the free movement of people across borders between Canada and the United States. And you've seen air traffic and passenger traffic for discretionary travel drop quite significantly. But what you haven't seen is any issues related to the production platforms. Supply chains between Canada and the United States, whether they're for agriculture and food products, which is entirely important, manufacturing, PPE, any of those issues, the truck traffic going back and forth over the border and the movement of goods has only gone down between 1% and 5%, depending on the border crossing. We found a way by cooperating with each other and having discussions and making sure it was coordinated to protect people from COVID and yet keep the economy going in that North American production platform. And I think that's the key. You want to use the tools you can to achieve the things that you want to achieve on a domestic basis, and you want to make sure that you still get those benefits of trade, like Sandi was talking about, the ability to have increased access of goods that you may not have enough of, or that you can get at lower prices and still take the appropriate steps to protect your domestic market.
All right, well, we've run out of time. I really want to thank everybody for participating. Consul General Wayne Robson of Chicago, Neal Kemmet, the CEO of ACE Ethanol and Stanley, U.S. Representative Ron Kind, a member of the House Ways and Means Committee, and last but not least, certainly Sandi Siegel, president of Emmy Day and Company and co-host of the Talking Trade webcast. I want to thank the Government of Canada and UW-Madison Center for East Asian Studies for helping us with this program. You've been watching Trade Reset, how a new Washington, D.C. administration may change trade policy near and far. WisPolitics and WisBusiness are working on programming for 2021. Welcome your suggestions always. You can email me at mayers, M-A-Y-E-R-S, at wispolitics.com. Again, welcome your suggestions. Thank you all for tuning in. We'll also have a recorded version of this on our YouTube channel soon, and that'll be open to everybody. So thank you all, panel, for participating in this important discussion. Thank you, audience, and we'll see you next year with some new programming from wispolitics.com and WisBusiness. This is Jeff Mayers signing off.